Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 774, and today is March 25th, 2025. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. We have a lot of news to get through on today's show. This is the makeup show from last week, so catching up on a little bit of the news that we missed, and of course, the top headlines from overnight yesterday into today. And there is a lot of big news. First, a little bit of big news that's good news. The Libertarian Institute has hit our fundraising goal, and actually we had another donor come in, offer an additional $5,000 in matching funds. And so if you were considering getting one of our great gifts that we give our donors, like a signed copy of the book for vote, you can still head on over and make a donation and receive that gift. But we have hit our goal, and I appreciate to everyone in this audience. I know quite a few of you headed on over to the Libertarian Institute and made a donation over this past month. That's what keeps us going. That's what allows me to do this show and all the writing that I do. So that is huge, and I really appreciate it. Also, a lot of you have subscribed to my new channel, the Kyle Anzalone Show, but if you haven't already, yesterday I interviewed Scott Horton, the Libertarian Institute's director, and what I think was maybe one of the most fun interviews that I've done on the show so far. So you don't want to miss that out. Head on over to the YouTube channel, subscribe so you catch all the episodes, but also make sure you watch the episode with Scott. Is the first link that I have in the show notes page wherever you're listening to the show. And of course, as always, just share out the show. It's at YouTube, Rumble, Odysee, anywhere you can listen to audio podcasts. I post everything I do on my Twitter handle at @KyleAnzalone_. Let's jump into the news today. So first up here, we're talking about the big story that happened that broke yesterday. Atlantic editor Jeffrey Goldberg publishes a story that Mike Waltz, the national security advisor, added him to a private Signal chat with other top-ranking Trump cabinet officials, including Pete Hegseth, Marco Rubio, Tulsi Gabbard, and even advisors of Donald Trump. And what they were apparently doing was discussing the potential of attacking Yemen. And so this is huge news, and I think there's probably 3 or 4 major stories here that we could talk about. One is just that this happened in the first place, and, for all the other details that we'll talk about aside, that the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, that the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, are discussing things in a Signal chat where everybody isn't just going and looking to make sure who is and who isn't in that chat, seems to be a real question on Americans' intelligence and security behind that. And so that's a big concern and a big red flag and a big problem for the Trump administration. Now, I don't think that should maybe be the top story that everyone's talking about. It certainly is an important part of this story. Certainly, if you remember back to like Benghazi with Hillary Clinton, that she had this private server in her bathroom that she was using to conduct State Department business, was an important part of that story, but it was not the most important part of that story. And so I think the most important part of this story is what Dave DeCamp wrote up at antiwar.com yesterday. He said Vance cautioned against bombing Yemen, calling it a mistake. So Vice President J.D. Vance cautioned against bombing Yemen before the U.S. restarted its airstrikes on the country, calling it a mistake, and suggested delaying the attack by 1 month, according to a leaked Signal conversation between administration officials. So Goldberg, a reporter, I believe the editor at The Atlantic, was included in the Signal thread, apparently by accident, although I'll get into that in a minute, which is how he obtained the conversation. An account believed to be Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth shared details of the March 15th airstrikes on Yemen 2 hours before they happened, and the White House confirmed that the single conversation appeared to be authentic. So, a day before the airstrikes, an account labeled J.D. Vance expressed misgivings about the idea of targeting Houthis. Vance, as the account said, "Team, I am out for the day doing an economic event in Michigan, but I think we are making a mistake." Vance framed his opposition to the airstrikes based on President Trump's policies towards Europe, which have involved pressuring the Europeans to pay more for their own militaries to be less reliant on the U.S. Vance pointed out that only a small percentage of U.S. shipping goes through the Suez Canal as compared to European trade. He said 3% of U.S. trade runs through the Suez, 40% of European trade does. There is a real risk the public doesn't understand this or why it's necessary. The strongest reason to do this, as POTUS said, to send a message. I am not sure the president is aware how inconsistent this is with his message on Europe right now. There is a further risk that we see a moderate to severe spike in oil prices. I am willing to support the consensus of the team and keep these concerns to myself, but there is a strong argument for delaying this a month, doing the messaging work on why this matters, seeing where the economy is, etc. An account believed to be Joe Kent, and this would have been a representative that was added to the chat, or was, added to the chat at the request of Tulsi Gabbard, the director of national intelligence. President Trump's nominee to lead the National Counterterrorism Center explained to Vance, "There is nothing time sensitive driving the timeline. We will have the exact same options in a month." Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, responded to Vance by saying that the messaging to the American people about the war would focus on President Biden failing to deter Yemeni attacks and Houthis being Iranian-funded. Iran is aligned with the Houthis, but it's unclear how much support they are giving the group, or, and this is particularly important, how much, if any, direction the Houthis are taking from Iran. I think it's actually very possible that even if the Houthis do receive some support from Tehran would actually prefer the Houthis not to carry out these attacks and be stoking so much tensions with the Americans right now. U.S. officials have acknowledged that the Houthis do not take orders from Tehran and have their own weapon supply. So this is the message that Hegseth his account wrote to Vance. VP, I understand your concerns, and I fully support you raising with POTUS important considerations, most of which are tough to know how they play out. Economy, Ukraine peace, Gaza, etc. I think messaging is going to be tough on this matter no matter what. Nobody knows who the Houthis are, which is why we need to stay focused on Biden failed and Iran funded. So Hegseth also disputed the idea that the strikes could wait, saying that he wanted it to happen before the Gaza ceasefire fell apart and before Israel attacked Yemen. The U.S. launched the strikes on March 15th, just a few days after the Houthis, officially known as Ansar Allah, announced they would reimpose their blockade on Israeli shipping through, their coastline, the Red Sea, in response to Israeli ceasefire violations, which included imposing a full blockade on all goods, all aid entering Gaza. Hegseth said, waiting a few weeks or a month does not fundamentally change the calculus. 2 immediate risks on waiting. 1, this leads and we look indecisive. Israel takes action, and then 2, Israel takes action first, or Gaza ceasefire falls apart and we don't get to start this on our own terms. We can manage both. We are prepared to execute, and if I had the final go or no vote now, I believe we should. So Hegseth also claimed that bombing Yemen wasn't really about the Houthis and suggested the messaging would focus on protecting shipping. He said, this is not about the Houthis. I see it as 2 things: restoring freedom of navigation, a core national interest, and reestablishing deterrence, which Biden catered. But we can easily pause, and if we do, I will do all we can to enforce 100% operational security. I welcome other thoughts. And, this is just baffling because at the time, Jeffrey Goldberg is in the chat, so they have a journalist in the chat when they're saying they're going to ensure operational security. So, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, who added Goldberg to the chat, made his argument for bombing Yemen, saying it would have to be the United States that reopens the shipping lanes, and that the administration would figure out ways to get the Europeans to pay. Per the president's request, we are working with DoD and state to determine how to compile the cost associated and levy them on the Europeans. Vance said that he would agree with whatever Hegseth's decision was. If you think we should do it, let's go. I just hate bailing the Europeans out again. The first round of U.S. airstrikes on Yemen killed at least 53 people, including 5 children and 2 women, according to the Yemeni Health Ministry. Administration officials celebrate the strikes in the chat, including Waltz, who, if you're watching the show right now, you can see he sent like a fist bump emoji, an American flag, and then the fire emoji. So, since the initial airstrikes, the Houthis have carried out multiple attacks targeting the U.S. aircraft carrier, the USS Harry Truman, which U.S. officials have said were intercepted. The Houthis have also begun firing missiles at Israel in response to Israel restarting its massive bombing campaign on Gaza. The Houthis ceased their attacks on Israel and Israeli-linked shipping when the Gaza ceasefire went into effect on January 19th. The group has maintained that the only way to stop attacks now is for another truce in Gaza and to end the Israeli blockade on aid entering the Strip. While the Trump administration officials' conversation was focused on the impact on shipping, the U.S. bombing campaign on Yemen is more about backing Israel. The Israeli news site Ynet reported that the U.S. has told Israel not to worry about retaliating against the Houthis for the recent missile attacks, saying that the U.S. will handle it. President Trump is threatening the Houthis with annihilation, but a year-long U.S. bombing campaign launched by Joe Biden from January 2024 to January 2025 did not stop the Houthis, and a brutal U.S.-backed Saudi-led war on Yemen from 2015 to 2022 also failed to remove the group from power. So now I want to get into a little bit more of my analysis from all of this. And the first is I want to distinctly consider the possibility, and for my audience to consider the possibility, that Waltz did not add Goldberg by mistake. That Waltz maybe had fallen out of power with Donald Trump. Influence wasn't maybe having the role that he wanted in the administration. And so this was a way to blow up Trump's National Security Council. Tulsi Gabbard's in the chat. Joe Kent speaks in it. Hegseth, J.D. Vance. These are kind of all the figures in the Trump administration who one would consider maybe contrary to the establishment foreign policy. Not that they are dissidents when it comes to Israel or really have major differences in foreign policy from the establishment, but say when it comes to the war in Ukraine, these are people who are more interested in ending the war. They're not interested in subsidizing and bailing out the Europeans constantly, as J.D. Vance explains. And so this foreign policy is different than the one advocated by, say, Mike Waltz before he became the National Security Advisor. And look, Jeffrey Goldberg has been instrumental in putting together stories about Donald Trump that have turned out to be inauthentic, like the suckers and losers story. And I really do wonder if this was maybe cooked up by Mike Waltz to embarrass and maybe even lead to the resignations of Pete Hegseth, Tulsi Gabbard, Joe Kent, and others in the administration. Now, certainly could lead to his resignation or firing as well, but if he didn't have influence with Trump already, maybe he already thought he was on the way out, then this, he essentially sets himself off as a suicide bomber in this group chat, right? So that's one thing I really want to consider. Another thing is that in the reporting on all of this, Goldberg makes it seem like Hegseth, but doesn't actually say what Hegseth said, but Hegseth shared information within this group chat that provided operational details of the U.S. strikes on Yemen before they happened. And I think it's entirely possible that this happened. I also think it's possible that Goldberg is making it sound more salacious than it actually is in order to make it sound like there's a bigger scandal here. It's possible that Hegseth said, we are going to target the Houthi general such and such in his home in Sadr at this time with this size bomb. Certainly these are all like operational intelligence information that if they have gotten to the Houthis 2 hours ahead of time could have thwarted the US attack. It's also possible that Hegseth said something as vague as, we're going to target Houthi military leadership. We're going to target the Houthi missile or the Houthi drone program, right? These are all things that people kind of knew anyways when the U.S. was going to carry out strikes against Yemen, that these were going to be their targets. And so these really wouldn't be operational details. And of course, this leads me to my next point, which is Goldberg's reporting on all of this, where it seems the only person who really gets a negative light shined on them in all this is J.D. Vance for resisting this, and then Pete Hegseth for sharing the operational details ahead of time. But there's not a whole lot of criticism of Mike Waltz in the article. It's just, he made a silly little mistake letting Goldberg in this chat, and Goldberg was very responsible how he handled and he reported this information. Rather than, trying to generate a bigger scoop, rather than getting more information, Goldberg actually exited the chat himself, right? He wasn't even removed from this, and it's just his reporting on all this raises so many red flags for me. But it does also expose him as being, not a real journalist, but rather a state stenographer who's willing to put out the information that the state, that not necessarily Donald Trump himself, but the deep state, the foreign policy establishment, the entrenched bureaucracy in the Beltway, that they want you to know, and not necessarily the information that the American people really need to know. So I think that's all my thoughts on this article. I think this is going to be a major story, a major scandal that's probably going to lead to a shakeup in the Trump administration. I would be shocked if it doesn't. And it is interesting just, I guess, how little of a fight that J.D. Vance apparently put up here, and how easily that this was all agreed to. All right, moving on. These are some of the stories from the last week that we missed. Boeing wins contract to develop new U.S. fighter jet. This one from our friend Will Porter at antiwar.com, March 21st. President Donald Trump has touted a new contract with Boeing to produce Air Force's 6th generation fighter jet, the F-47. The announcement comes after years of trouble with the F-35, which has been plagued by technical problems and cost overruns for the last decade. So Trump announced the project for the Next Generation Air Dominance NGAD platform during a Oval Office presser on Friday, saying the F-47 would be the Pentagon's most lethal warplane and something the likes of which nobody has ever seen before. In terms of all the attributes of a fighter jet, there's nothing been anything close to it, from speed to maneuverability to what it can have as payload, and this has been in the works for a long period of time. The 47th president said, American enemies will never see it coming. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, Air Force Chief of Staff General David Alvin, and Air Force Acquisitions Deputy Lieutenant General Dale White also attended the press conference alongside Trump. Alvin similarly referred to the fighter jet as having long been in the works, saying test models have already been flown hundreds of hours. I do believe China is also developing their 6th generation aircraft, and they actually had pictures of theirs published in December. And it does look quite a bit like the mock rendering of the F-47. He claimed that the plane would cost less to produce than the Lockheed Martin F-22 Raptor, and said the Air Force would eventually possess more of the NGAD fighters than Raptors. The Air Force fleet currently contains about 185 F-22s, each reportedly costing some $350 million, making the older plane one of the most expensive in the U.S. arsenal, according to the National Interest. While the Trump administration has declined to reveal the project costs over the new F-47, the price has been a major sticking point, with former Air Force Secretary Frank Kendall even imposing a strategic pause on the project last year. It was expected to triple the cost of the Pentagon's fifth-generation multi-role fighter, the F-35. Supposedly, the U.S.'s most advanced warplane, the F-35 has faced major technological and budgetary problems both before and after it entered service in 2015. Though it was designed to replace the older jets, the F-35 has been plagued by a long list of design flaws, and it earned itself the title of the most expensive weapon system in human history, thanks to cost overruns throughout its development. Despite years of upgrades, the Pentagon Review published last year found that operational sustainability of its planes remained below service expectations and requirement, also reporting critical failures in several F-35 components. Nonetheless, the plane was approved for full-rate production soon after, and around the same time was cleared to carry nuclear weapons. Boeing later issued its own statement on the F-47 platform, noting the jet would be an essential node in a whole new family of systems. In preparation for this mission, we made the most significant investment in history of our defense business, and we are ready to provide the most advanced and innovative NGAD aircraft needed to support the mission, said Steve Parker, the interim president and CEO for Boeing Defense, Space, and Security. Boeing has been awarded billions in tax dollars over the years to develop a number of older U.S. combat aircraft, including the F-4 Phantom, the F-15 Eagle, the F-A-18 Hornet, and the EA-18G Growler. And so I'm sure this next one is going to just cost a ton of money and not perform as well as it is supposed to. Also, something worth noting, I do believe when we had the 6th generation fighter jet, the Pentagon does plan to have the wingmen for these fighter jets to be autonomous and unmanned aerial vehicles. So essentially it'll be like the fighter jet and then flanked by a bunch of drones. All right, next up here, a couple updates on diplomacy and potential talks between Russia and Ukraine. First here, Zelensky. Russia has influenced the Trump administration. Ukrainian President Zelensky criticized the White House for allegedly succumbing to Kremlin propaganda. The Ukrainian leader said some in the Trump administration were incorrectly convinced that Kiev did not want to reach a deal with Moscow. So Zelensky said in an interview with Time magazine that was done early last week but published on Sunday, "I believe Russia has managed to influence some people in the White House team through information. Trump has faced criticisms that he has been under the influence of Russian President Vladimir Putin since he first ran for president. During the Russiagate saga following the 2016 race, Trump faced a seemingly endless string of allegations that he was under the control of the Kremlin, all of which were thoroughly debunked. Still, American politicians and political commenters frequently attacked Trump for being too close to Russia. Zelensky offered Kiev's position on ceasefire talks as proof the Kremlin was proof of the Kremlin's sway in the White House. He said, Russia's signal to the American was that the Ukrainians do not want to end the war and something should be done to force them. However, during a heated Oval Office exchange between Zelensky, Trump, and Vice President J.D. Vance last month, the Ukrainian leader attacked Vance for advocating diplomacy with Russia. While Zelensky did not cite any members of the Trump administration by name, the chair of Ukraine's Foreign Affairs Committee attacked Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff. The Ukrainian lawmaker questioned whether Witkoff worked for Putin or Trump, then went on to demand that he should be fired. The Ukrainian lawmaker said Witkoff should be removed as representative of Trump because he discredits the United States and the U.S. foreign policy. The criticism of the Trump administration comes as U.S. and Ukrainian officials continue to engage in talks in Saudi Arabia. On Sunday and Monday, the U.S. and Ukrainian officials met in Riyadh. Russian officials similarly held talks with the American officials in Riyadh on Monday as well, and we will get into those talks now. So, we have this one that I wrote for the Libertarian Institute on March 24th. U.S. holds separate talks with Russian and Ukrainian officials. American officials met with a Russian delegation for talks on ending the war in Ukraine. Moscow says it hopes to restore a deal that allows commercial ships to cross the war zone in the Black Sea. According to TASS, the Kremlin's top concern is the restoration of the 2022 deal that permitted cargo ships to carry fertilizer across the contested waters. So Russian presidential aide Yuri Yushkalov said that the main topic of consultations was the resumption of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, the outlet reported. TASS noted that Russian President Vladimir Putin and President Donald Trump discussed the issue during a call last week. The Black Sea Grain Initiative was in place for a year before Russia withdrew, saying it was unable to benefit from the agreement due to the Western sanctions on Moscow. The Russian delegation was led by senior diplomat Grigory B. Karkasin. The talks lasted for 12 hours, and Russia's state media reported that Washington and Moscow may issue a joint statement on Tuesday. The American side expected to discuss a 30-day limited ceasefire proposed by Trump. Both Moscow and Kiev said they support ending attacks on energy infrastructure. However, those strikes have continued. Ukrainian President Zelensky said he would provide the U.S. with a list of targets that he hoped would be protected during the truce. The talks with Russian officials followed U.S. and Ukrainian talks on Sunday. The American delegation was meeting with representations from Moscow and Kiev in the Saudi capital of Riyadh. Kiev said that Ukrainian officials will meet with the American delegation for a second consecutive day of talks on Monday following the U.S.-Russian meeting. The Ukrainian team was headed by the Russian Defense Minister Rustam Umerov, who called Sunday's talks productive and focused. Trump expected the negotiations with Ukraine would soon lead to Kiev signing a revenue-sharing agreement for Ukraine's minerals. Ukrainian foreign minister said any deal with Russia would come with additional Western support for Kiev. He explained on X, any diplomacy with Moscow must be backed up by firepower, sanctions, and pressure. And of course, all those things will likely kill any diplomacy between Moscow and Kiev. So this is an interesting story. Iran says it's open to indirect talks with the U.S. The Iranian foreign minister said Monday that Tehran was open to the idea of indirect talks with the U.S., but rejected direct negotiations in the face of increasing U.S. sanctions. The foreign minister said the way is to open indirect negotiations, adding that there would be no direct talks until there is change in the other side's approach towards the Islamic Republic. And it is important to note, for all of the Ayatollah's rhetoric on how you can't negotiate with the Americans under President Donald Trump, he hasn't officially ruled it out or forbade it. And so I do think it's a possibility that they really are open to these negotiations. So next up, this one absolutely heartbreaking here from Dave DeCamp. Gaza Health Ministry releases the names of 15,613 children killed by Israel since October of 2023. So Gaza's health ministry on Monday released the names of the 15,600 plus children who have been killed by the U.S.-backed Israeli assault on Gaza since October of 2023. The children were included on a list of 50,021 Palestinians who have been killed by the IDF and have been fully identified. The first 27 pages of the list includes just infants killed by the Israeli military who didn't reach their first birthday, accounting for 876 of the dead children. And remember how much outrage was generated from the 40 beheaded baby hoax. The idea that Hamas would have killed 40 Israeli children on October 7th. We've seen Israel kills so many Palestinian children every single day. So children aged 6 to 12 were the most represented age group among the children killed by Israel, accounting for 36.8%. Children aged 13 to 17 accounted for 31.2%, while children aged 1 to 5 accounted for 26.3%, while infants made up 5.7% of the 15,000 children killed. So just absolutely horrific, and more details behind, what it really means that 50,000 people have been confirmed dead. And of course, the number killed by Israel is far, far higher. This is just a minimum. Okay, so this is another statement from Dr. Feroz, who we've been talking about on the show. He's in contact with antiwar.com. He is an American trauma surgeon volunteering in Gaza, and he told antiwar.com that he came close to being hit by an Israeli airstrike that targeted the Nasser hospital in Khan Yunis on Sunday night and killed a 16-year-old boy he was treating. The doctor explained that he was on his way to the male surgical ward, which was hit by the Israeli strike, when someone asked him to help with a patient who was bleeding in the ICU. So I went there and helped, and about 10 minutes later, the explosion happened. So I probably would have been standing right next to Ibrahim, the boy who died, had, he not been called away. Feroz said that he planned to change the boy's medical dressings. I probably would have been standing next to him and talking to his family when the explosion happened if they hadn't pulled me into the unit like that. The bombing also killed Ismail Bahroum, a member of Hamas's political bureau, who was being treated at the hospital. The Israeli military took credit for the strike, saying Bahroum was the target. Now, just to make it clear that if a political, even a Hamas political figure is receiving, or even if it was a military figure, was receiving treatment at the hospital, that would not make the hospital a valid target. Now, say, I guess Hamas was actually using the ICU as a location to launch mortars into Israel or to, snipe Israeli troops. Well, at least then you can make an argument that was being used as a military facility, but that they're just saying somebody was getting medical treatment at this hospital. And hospitals tend to, treat anybody who comes to their doors during times of war. And, that doesn't make them an active target that you could hit at any time. Israel military kills 2 journalists in separate attacks, and actually one of these journalists was distinctly targeted. I believe it was Hassam Shabat, a reporter from Al Jazeera, who Israel said was Hamas, which wasn't true at all. This is just about silencing and making sure that there are no Palestinians to tell the world what is happening. I believe by the international account, about 170 Palestinian journalists in Gaza have been killed since October 7th. And then from the Gaza media office count, the number is now over 200 at 208. Next up here, this is a story I wrote for antiwar.com on March 23rd. Report: Netanyahu demanded the IDF bomb homes without intelligence. So early in the conflict, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu ordered the head of the Israeli military to hit thousands of targets without intelligence, including homes. According to Nahum Barea's report in Ynet, IDF Chief of Staff Herze Havale told Netanyahu during a meeting on October 9, 2023, that the IDF was already bombing 1,500 targets per day. The sources explained to the Ynet officer that Netanyahu banged on the table and demanded, "Why not 5,000?" When the prime minister was told the IDF lacked intelligence to conduct so many strikes, he replied, "I'm not interested in targets. Take down houses, bomb with everything you have." Previously, 972 magazine reported that the IDF had employed an AI program dubbed Lavender to mark Palestinians as members of Hamas. This program increased the number of targets the IDF would generate, with a source explaining that it treated the outputs of the AI machine as if they were human decisions. In total, 37,000 Palestinians were put on Lavender's target list, with many of them killed in their homes, including along with dozens of family members. Sources discussed with the outlet how they changed the inputs in Lavender so the AI would add additional names to the list. One day, totally of my own accord, I added something like 1,200 new targets to the tracking system because the number of attacks we were conducting decreased, the source said. That made sense to me. In retrospect, it seems like a serious decision I made, and such decisions were not made at high levels. So since October 7th, 2023, the Gaza Health Ministry has reported over 50,000 Palestinians killed in the Israeli onslaught, although some experts put the number of dead well over 100,000. Last week, Tel Aviv broke a ceasefire and hostage deal it struck with Hamas. The Israeli military resumed large-scale airstrikes and reinvaded Gaza. The Washington Post reports that Netanyahu is now preparing an even more aggressive military campaign in the Strip. The outlet noted that the prime minister has been emboldened by the new military leadership in Tel Aviv, as well as President Trump's support in Washington. As Tel Aviv continues to adopt a more brutal policy for Gaza, a new video of Israel's ambassador to Austria, David Roth, exposed him calling for the execution of armed Palestinian minors. He said there should be a death sentence for teenagers holding guns or a grenade. Now, one more thing I want to point out about this story, that 972 magazine article that I frequently cite on this show was written by one of the co-directors of the Oscar-winning documentary No Other Land. Now, he is currently reporting on Twitter, on X, that one of his Palestinian co-directors of that film was beaten and abducted first by Israeli settlers. I believe he called it a lynching, and then the director was then seized by the IDF, and his current whereabouts are unknown. All right, so before we wrap up the show for today, want to mention this one. Israel sends more troops into Syria, launches multiple strikes on multiple sites. This one from Jason Ditz at antiwar.com, May 23rd. Israel continued its attacks on Syria this weekend, sending more troops to the Quneitra governance near the occupied Golan Heights, and also launching multiple airstrikes against Israeli military sites in Syria, including the military airport in Tadmur. The Tadmur strikes came early Saturday morning, targeting the Palmyra Air Base and the nearby military airfield. 2 members of the Syrian military were reportedly wounded in the attack, according to the reports. Tadmur was historically known as the ancient city of Palmyra, which is why some media reports refer to it as the Tamir Air Base. Later Saturday evening, Israel attacked military installations, officers' residence just south of Damascus in the suburb Nadhaza. Damage was reported, but so far, no official casualty figures have been claimed. So, in Israel, I believe just today is again ramping up its attacks in Syria, just launching wide-scale bombings of that country. Absolutely horrific. All right, everybody, that will do it for the show for today. So just a heads up on the schedule for the rest of the week. Another show of Conflicts of Interest tomorrow, then tomorrow afternoon, 4:45 Eastern Time. I will be back with another episode of the Kyle Anzalone Show. I have a I'm very excited about interviewing. This will be somebody who I'm interviewing for the first time, and I think you all are going to love the interview. And so I really recommend that you head on over to the Kyle Anzalone Show YouTube channel and subscribe. That way you do not miss that interview. And if you can, watch it live. Help us out with our live numbers. Thanks, everyone, and we'll be back with another episode tomorrow.